When you look into the eyes of the dead, sometimes they look back at you. When a boy visits a museum and comes upon a mummified body on display, he begins to experience horrific day and nightmares that he can't escape. An ancient creature stalks him from the shadows, and its hunger and torment are endless. Will he survive, or will the abyss swallow him like helpless prey being trapped within the jaws of a Nile crocodile? This is the untold story of the terrifying haunting of Caleb Weaver, also known as the Curse of the Mummy case. This one is very scary to say the least, so I don't recommend that you watch this episode alone or in the dark. Now, let us begin. Our story begins in Geneva, New York in the year 1997. Situated along Seneca Lake, Geneva, New York is known for its scenic beauty and historic charm. However, underneath this wholesome place lies an underbelly of darkness. 14-year-old Caleb Weaver, his parents Chris and Susan, and his grandmother are spending time together one morning. Caleb, who is excited to go on a field trip this day, is explaining to his parents that his class is visiting a museum. Little does he know that these series of events would alter his life forever. Caleb and his class were visiting a local museum that had recently acquired Egyptian artifacts dating back to 2000 BC. Marvelous displays of jewelry, pottery, and amongst the inventory laid something more mortifying. As the young man and his classmates perused the various exhibits, one signal suddenly cut through the static of the rest. Upon seeing it, Caleb froze in his tracks. There before his eyes laid a mummified body. As he stared into the holes where the eyes once sat, he suddenly felt as if whoever this person was in that moment was staring directly back at him. The mummy was speculated to have once been a priestess who worshipped a violent god. As he stared into the face of the mummified priestess, Caleb is suddenly overcome with a sharp sense of dread, unlike anything he's ever felt before. Feeling as if he had to escape whatever was causing this, he soon breaks from the crowd of his classmates and heads back to the bus. As he heads back to school and eventually back home for the night, he can't help but replay the face of the mummy over and over again in his mind. Its teeth gnarled, eye sockets hollow, and its leathered skin seared itself deep into his memory. That evening, as he sits down at the dinner table with his family, Caleb's father asked him just how the trip had went. In response, the boy tells his parents that he was disturbed at the sight of the mummy and that seeing it truly bothered him. Caleb's parents, believing their son was overcome with anxiety upon seeing what was a dead body on display, comfort him. They explained that although it's frightening, it's normal to have these kinds of feelings about seeing death face to face, and that everything was going to be okay, that he should try to relax. However, relaxing, as we'll come to see, isn't in Caleb's future. As the rest of the family lays their heads on their pillows and fall asleep, and a large moon hangs above the Weaver home, something else was very awake and watching. Caleb, who was asleep in his bed, was getting anything but rest. In his dream, he was wandering through a dark and foreboding stone structure. At the end of the path laid before him the very same mummy that he had seen in his waking life. As he stared at its decayed face in horror, deep from within the eye sockets, slit pupils began to emerge and stare at him with utter intensity. From behind its rotten teeth, a swarm of locusts began to emerge and fly towards him. As he was panicking in his nightmare, he soon shakes himself back to the waking world. As he glances around the room, he's at first relieved. That was until he sees something standing in the corner of his room. There, amongst the shadows cast by the moonlight coming through the window, stands a large and foreboding figure, one that appears to be wearing some kind of robe. Caleb's pupils dilate with fear as he sees glowing green eyes from beneath its hood. As it steps closer towards him, more light reveals jagged and sharp-looking teeth that glint like daggers. The creature then suddenly lets out a deep, guttural growl that pierces the young man's soul and injects pure terror into his heart. As Caleb screams, he soon tucks himself underneath his blanket in an attempt to protect himself. Meanwhile, the creature's heavy footsteps inch closer and closer to him. Peering through the sheet and towards its direction, Caleb sees it now standing over him. Just as he thinks it's about to maul him, the entity, as quickly as it appeared, suddenly vanishes. Shaking as he slowly pulls the sheet from over his head, the young man is petrified. Needless to say, he does not sleep for the rest of the night. The following morning, as an exhausted Caleb is getting ready for school, he tries to convince himself that it was all just a bad dream. That was until his mother asked him just what all that noise was in his room last night. Shocked that she had heard anything, he tells her that something had stalked him from within the darkness of his room. That whatever this thing or this monster was, that it had growled and that he could hear it breathing. His parents, believing that he had heard something but perhaps his imagination had run wild, told him that the house was old, that maybe he had heard the pipes rustling or the home settling, that he was probably still freaked out from seeing a real mummy, but that all these things had explanations, that he was getting too old to be scared of monsters. But monsters sometimes do exist. In the weeks to come, Caleb Weaver finds himself unable to break the chains of anxiety. No matter where he goes or what he does, he feels as if he's being watched by a presence that he can't explain. Despite this now constant state of suffering, he chooses to remain silent, not wanting to face ridicule. One afternoon, Caleb is walking home from school, and upon arriving at the house and approaching the front door, he reaches to open it, but it's locked. Rummaging through his pockets, he's realized that everyone else was out of the house and that he had left his keys inside earlier that morning. There was another way into the house, however. It was through the cellar. As he makes his way to the side of the house and unlatches the door to it, he once again can't help but feel as if unseen eyes are staring. As he descends the stone stairs into the cellar itself, as he reaches its depths, he pauses. He suddenly begins to hear a chorus of whispers coming from within the darkness. Then, a fear unlike anything he's felt since the night he had seen the mummy for the first time grips him. Glowing green eyes emerge from where the whispers had originated, and stepping forth was once again this menacing creature. With daylight rays partially coming through the small windows of the cellar, Caleb is able to make out more features than the first time he had laid eyes on it. It wore a hood like it had before, but underneath it, its face was animalistic, like that of a crocodile. It was covered in scales, massive and imposing. It walked towards him, upright, like a man. To him it appeared as some kind of abhorrent science experiment, or something from another plane of existence. He felt as though he had accidentally wandered into its domain, that he had unknowingly trespassed, and this entity, whatever it was enraged. Then, with pure ferocity, it runs at a dead sprint towards him. Feeling his fight or flight kick in and his adrenaline surge, Caleb runs as fast as humanly possible back up the stairs and out of the cellar itself. As he slams the door behind him, and runs to the gate of the yard. He collapses onto his knees trying to catch his breath. He knows that whatever he was dealing with was not of this world and that he was a target. Caleb, as a result of the torment, begins to isolate, and quickly his parents notice an alarming change occur in his behavior. He grew more restless and angry. He was quieter than usual, but little did they truly know just how intense his inner war was becoming. The next several weeks following the cellar event are quiet. However, the young man continues to feel the omnipresent force that has come to plague him. Trying to adapt to handling the stalking, he tries not to come home alone whenever possible. But one night, he returns home from an after-school activity to find himself alone at the house. As he steps inside and slowly walks around, he's cautious and on edge. It's as if the air itself is charged with electricity. As he heads into the kitchen to find himself something to eat, when he opens the fridge, the pantry door from behind him violently slams shut out of nowhere. Feeling anxiety grip him and feeling sick to his stomach, he runs into the nearby bathroom. Shutting the door behind him and attempting to calm himself, he splashes his face with cold water in the sink. As he takes a hand towel and dries his face, he looks up at the mirror, but it's not just his reflection staring back at him. There, in the corner of the room, stands the same horrifying creature, and it's slowly coming towards him. As he turns to face its direction, all he can see is the empty bathroom. But turning back to the mirror, he sees the monster inching ever closer. He then begins to feel a sharp, white-hot pain overtake him. Screaming in agony, it feels as if an animal has latched onto his left arm, and it refuses to let go. Yet this thing was invisible. As he holds on for dear life, he is suddenly released, and then collapses to the floor. Crying out, he clutches his arm, and soon realizes that he's leaking blood. Upon lifting up his shirt, he sees several distinct-looking bite marks. Scared out of his mind, and with his parents not taking him seriously, the poor boy decides to keep his attack and wound a secret, and he slowly bandages it up. In the weeks following these events, Caleb would further spiral into an abyss of despair. With each passing day, he gets more and more depressed and ends up having a nervous breakdown. As a result of this, his family gets him counseling with a therapist, but the silent suffering due to the paranormal attacks only continues. The weeks then turned into months, and the months to years. As soon as Caleb graduates high school, he moves out of his childhood home, hoping and praying that by getting out, that this entity would stay behind, that he could finally move on with his life. In 2013, he ends up finding a job as a security guard in Glen Burnie, Maryland. Slowly but surely, to his surprise, Caleb starts to regain a sense of normalcy and control to his life. He climbs the corporate ladder and becomes a supervisor at his job. He falls in love with a woman named Laura and soon makes friends with a young man who begins working for him by the name of John Drenner Jr. One weekend, while John, Caleb, and Laura are camping, the group is making small talk over a campfire, and John can't help but notice a scar on one of Caleb's arms. Although Caleb isn't forthcoming at first, given the sensitivity of the subject at hand, John begins to open up about his own experiences dealing with the demonic. As a young man, he had discovered a satanic Bible deep in the woods, and as a result formed an attachment, and ultimately had to be delivered by a minister. The very same man who delivered him, he was now a student of. After hearing a synopsis of John's harrowing tale, Caleb, keeping it brief, alludes to his own experiences. John can sense that there's more to his story, but relating to his own hardship, he knows that for fear of judgment and not wanting to push, Caleb had every right not to share the intimate details. Things following this night for the next several months are nothing short of normal. But as the holidays approach, Caleb, who hasn't seen his family since he moved, is invited back home. But he fears that it's not just his parents who are waiting for him there. After making the drive and greeting his mother at the door, Caleb cautiously steps foot back into the home where this creature had made his life a living hell. Later that night, he makes his way to his old bedroom to try and get some rest. As he curls up and begins reading a book to relax, he suddenly begins to hear a faint series of whispers. A name is repeated amongst these that he can make out over and over again. Sobek. Not familiar with what this could be, after the whispers pass, Caleb makes his way over to his laptop computer and tries to figure out just who or what this name was. As the results of the search load, everything he's ever experienced begins to make sense. Sobek is an ancient Egyptian deity that takes the appearance of a Nile crocodile fused with a man. Associated with chaos and power, those who worshipped it sought its protection as they entered the afterlife to pass from this world to whatever came next. Realizing that he perhaps for one reason or another had caught the attention of this entity whilst observing the mummy, that of which may have been one of its followers, Caleb sits on his childhood bed, contemplating just what he could do to resolve this situation that has plagued him for so long now. He is suddenly overcome by an unseen force. Thrown back onto his bed, he begins to seize and convulse violently. He wakes up the following morning utterly confused about the night before. Hoping to again sever any potential ties that still exist, Caleb then returns back home to Laura. But there's trouble in paradise. Upon returning both to his girlfriend, his job, and his friends, Caleb seems like a far cry from his usual self. Instead of being calm, rational, and kind, he has become bitter, angry, and rude. His behavior is so out of character that John ultimately contacts Laura privately and speaks with her about the changes. Caleb's behavior is all too reminiscent of his own dark past. Deciding to stage an intervention of sorts, several weeks after Caleb had initially returned, John meets Laura at her and Caleb's home, and the two nervously await his arrival after his shift ends. Caleb arrives momentarily, and asking why John was there, John cuts to the chase. He asks Caleb just what had happened to him when he had went back home. Caleb, with quiet rage building, doesn't open up. Seeing this manifest, John begins to explain to him that he believes that he's under spiritual attack. He then begins to say the first of several spiritual warfare prayers aloud, and as the words leave his lips, Caleb's face begins to twist into a wicked grin. As John further prays, Caleb begins laughing, but his laugh is nothing ordinary. It's dark and demonic, and soon the laughing turns into screams. He then grabs John by his collar, and with seemingly superhuman strength, he throws him across the room. Shaking and staring in shock at his friend, John soon realizes that he needs all the help that he can get. As the prayers continue, Caleb has a momentary break in his behavior. It's as if his true self, just for a moment, cuts through. He begs John to help him. He says that he's not in control of his own body. John takes full advantage of this moment. He makes a call to the man who had delivered him from the forces of darkness, and a short time later, he arrives. His mentor is a man by the name of Bill Bean. Bill himself too experienced evil in his childhood, and as a result, pursued the path of a deliverance minister. Bill, with Caleb's permission, for everyone's safety, handcuffs him to a nearby chair before the exorcism, can commence. Almost as soon as he begins to pray, like a switch being flipped, Caleb's behavior reverts back to mania. Screams the likes of which are seldomly heard both in decibels and range erupt out of him. His face begins to shift and morph into momentary glimpses of horror. His pupils, as he stares at Bill, become slits. He spits, tries to escape, and hurls blasphemies at the minister and those around him. After several grueling hours, Caleb suddenly takes a sharp inhale deep into his body and then unleashes an unholy screech into the air. His head and goes limp into his chest. As everyone gathers around him, a few tense minutes are shattered by Caleb coming to. They all knew in this moment that he had been delivered from this ominous force that had consumed his existence. Tears streamed down his face. It was as if he had woken up from a terrible nightmare into a world that was painted with grace and beauty. Following the events of this day, in April of 2014, Caleb and Laura would marry. They both knew in their heart of hearts that if the devil couldn't break them apart, nothing could. For love can blossom out of turmoil like petals unfurling during a thunderstorm. But somewhere in the ancient distance, in the space between realities, perhaps the chants of Sobek still echo the stone walls of time. There he perches upon his throne, lurking and waiting to stalk those who dare to disturb his followers' slumber. So the next time you find yourself observing those who are eternally sleeping within the glass cases of your local museum, be wary, be cautious, and don't let this be you. Before we go, I did want to briefly share my thoughts on this unique and intriguing case. Delving into my research for this one, I have to say I watched one of my favorite episodes portraying this story on a haunting called The Curse of the Mummy. Caleb, his mother, Laura, John, and Bill are all interviewed here, and I find them all to be sincere in their portrayals of what occurred. The acting too is chef's kiss. It's honestly some of my favorite from the show. Caleb seems like a very nice and kind guy, and he really seemed just really genuine in his descriptions of the torment that he endured. I did try to find some updates on either him or Laura, but I don't think they're on social media. And as always, even if they were, I seek to respect people's privacy, which that goes for anyone whose cases I cover and really in general. I hope wherever they are, however, that they're happy, thriving, and safe from any other paranormal torment. Now, interestingly, John Drenner Jr. is involved in this case, which a while back I made a video covering his story, which I'll link below and within this video itself if you want to check it out. He sadly, for reasons unknown, passed away several years ago, and may he rest in peace. But I've always found that his story and his involvement in this case were really interesting to say the least. I remember watching this episode way back when on a haunting and being intrigued, probably back in either, I want to say 2016 or 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And up until this point, until I had come back across this case, I didn't even realize that John was involved. We also have Bill Bean's involvement in this one as well. And he's a very intriguing guy with a very kind of crazy backstory, which I'm sure I'll delve into at some point, but he's truly made it his life's mission, it seems, to help others who have been affected by evil just like he was growing up, which is very respectable in my opinion. Now, I do have to say, I don't personally know these people, but I do have the pleasure of delving into their stories and just getting a feel for what they've experienced. And given my own experiences, I feel like this allows me to relate on a very profound spiritual and personal level, and I really do have nothing but respect for them. The entity that was mentioned as being the possessing spirit in this case was Sobek. It's also known as Sukas, and it was an ancient Egyptian deity with a complex history in nature. He's associated with the Nile crocodile and is usually represented as a crocodile or a crocodile-headed humanoid. He's also associated with pharaonic power, fertility, and military prowess, but he served additionally, is in particular important to this case, as a protective deity, with and was invoked especially for protecting others from the dangers presented by the Nile and crossing into the afterlife. Interestingly, the entire Fayum religion was a dedicated cult to this entity, and I'm curious if perhaps the mummy that Caleb viewed and somehow disturbed was possibly a priestess of this cult. That would perhaps explain why and how the entity felt the need to attach to him and torment him so, that it may have perceived him as a threat for one reason or another. Perhaps he had perceptions that weren't usual or typical to those around him, albeit it's possible that others too could have been affected by this entity as well. We don't and perhaps may never know if that was the case. But what do you think? Please share your thoughts down in the comments below. Leave this video a like if you enjoyed it, share it around, and subscribe. All those things help me out tremendously. If you'd like to further support my work, you can purchase my books or my content on DVD, USB, or Blu-ray now, as well as my other merch at mysteryarchives.store. I know most people don't collect physical media anymore, but I'm one of those folks that still does, so if you're old like me, or even if you want a collectible, you may check it out. Plus, look at it this way, it doesn't have ads on there, so there's that. I do offer my content ad-free for $5 a month over on Patreon as well. That's tier 2 or higher at patreon.com/mysteryarchives. Thank you all as always for allowing me to entertain you and for being so kind and supportive. I really and truly appreciate it. Until next time, this has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Make sure to stay safe out there and take care.